Hey, good morning, everyone. Welcome back to the Lookout. Thanks for joining us. Don't have a ton of time today, so I'm going to do a quick overview of current heat on the fires based on infrared flights from last night, and then we're going to jump in a little to talk about managing fire in the backcountry, challenges, opportunities, and we're going to use the Northwestern California fires as kind of an example because it's one of the only places left in California where folks are even really talking about letting fires burn on any sort of scale. So we're going to jump into the map tour here. We're going to do a quick run just from the south end here of our fire activity around Hayfork, Hyam Palm. Out here to the west of Redding. We're going to go up and look at the fires in northwestern California, and then we're going to take a quick trip up through western Oregon, look at the fires out by Roseburg. We don't have a lot of intel. We don't have any new intel on the fire up by Portland, but it sounds like it's been getting rained on and probably not doing much. Yellow here is just heat that's older than 24 hours, so we're really not seeing hardly any fresh heat on the infrared in Northern California, both with the aerial infrared, which is super detailed, and the satellite big picture stuff. So in red here, we've got the current fire perimeters. And as we've been doing for the last couple of days, we color previous fire lines with white. So places where there's red line and you can't see any white means the fire hasn't spread in the past 24 hours of mapping. And white is kind of the where it was the other day. So sometimes that just means that there's more accurate mapping. But in general, we can see here on the 3.9 fire, there's interior heat, and there's really no spread mapped in the last 24 hours outside the existing fire lines on the 3.9 fire. So this is South Fork Mountain, Hyam Palm at the top. We're looking kind of east. Lone Pine Fire by Hoopas showing no heat. Don't have any information. We didn't get any infrared, I don't think, for the Lost Fire here on the coast. But let's just jump in here to Orleans and start. We're going to look at the Pearch Fire in Orleans, the Hancock Fire in Woolly Creek, the Mosquito Fire, the Bluff 2, the Blue 2, etc. All right, so looking here at over Orleans to the east over the Pearch Fire. This has definitely been one of the kind of more interesting, even though it's not a huge fire, this has been an interesting one to watch. You can see there's not really hardly any heat showing here in the firing that got brought down Antenna Ridge. Down at the bottom, there's scattered heat. And the firing that was done day before yesterday is kind of cooling off. There's a little bit of spread here showing moving down the hill. It's not really close to the Perch Creek neighborhood. And we see some kind of small amount of spread over here. The white line is where the fire was, 36 hours ago. Really not much going on there. A little bit of kind of rollout here on some steep slopes. Backing down on the Butler side, a little bit of spread in an area that's continued to spread. A little bit of intense heat here, just, like 50 yards of spread. And where it's slopped over on the ridge, not a lot of spread there. As we've talked about every time we've looked at this fire, we didn't really expect that it would hold on this ridge, and not a lot of energy went into holding it on this ridge. And it may be that the rain and weather change is what keeps it on that ridge. So Perch, not a lot to report there. Coming around here, here's Soames Bar and the Salmon River. and Woolly Creek. And so we're going to talk later about the Hancock Fire in greater depth. Right now, the Hancock Fire really isn't moving much at all. There's a small enough amount of spread that it's hard to tell if it's just mapping error, but just little pockets of heat there. There is kind of a plan to put in some lines to try to contain this fire. Right now, it's not spreading, but there's potential. I will talk about that a little more later. Okay, over here to Mosquito and the Bluff 2. A little bit of spread on this kind of steep south end of Mosquito where we talked about where it kind of blew out and went up where they'd been holding mid-slope road for probably 10 days or more. A little bit of flanking spread on that, no headward spread. And some growth. This was a firing operation and some kind of interior growth and maybe a little bit of extension of that firing operation. I talked to a local Orleans Ranger District fuels person who's been working on these fires and said that the firing operations that they've done on this fire, as far as getting a chance to pretty much use good fire and box in these lightning fires from the start, has kind of been the highlight of his career. Just getting kind of limited resources. They've gone out here. They've done a lot of good burning. You can see blue to the Bluff fire here. There's barely any heat left in this thing. We looked at the severity maps from this the other day, and really, you can check out our fire effects video to see a little more detail on that. But not a lot of heat going on here, and basically it's too wet to burn for the most part. And so even though there are firing operations that are planned and kind of prepped for right now, it's just there's not they haven't got, it's not dry enough to get a good window to really keep firing. The weather forecast yesterday said, maybe a week to 10 days out, they expect that fuels will be dry enough again to sustain fire spread on these fires. And that doesn't mean that we won't have some south-facing slopes to get some wind on them and get some rollout, but basically what they're saying is, we don't expect major runs on these fires in the near term. This is the Blue 2 fire. A little bit of heat showing here outside of where it was mapped the day before yesterday. And a little headward spread up here. Kind of in what we were talking about, we kind of in places where you've got slope that are getting sun and some wind, you can get some runs right now, but really there's not a lot happening on these fires. Here's Copper Fire. Continue to kind of be slope-driven runs there. A little bit of backing. There were some high severity patches, kind of snag patches out in here, and this was the area that kind of blew up the hardest during our wind event before the rains. Over here to Elliot and Swillip fires. Minimal heat on these except a little bit on the backside here. But the yellow is the kind of the scattered heat, and we're just really not seeing much happening on these fires right now. As we talked about, there was kind of a firing operation that was happening out in here. And we could see that there's been a little bit of depth gained on that firing in the past maybe 36 hours. Here's U-Fish. I want to know who named this fire. Continued backing, where we see that white line, a little bit of spread outside there. They fired here. It's really cooling off. Not a lot of heat back here on Malone. Over here going up to Gasky. There's still some heat in the firing that happened along 199 corridor. There's a little bit of firing happening out here that's new. Above Darlingtonia, and then down here on the Coon Fire, they've kind of been firing down this road, which I can't remember right offhand which one that is, but really not any spread that we're seeing on this south end of the fire. There's a little bit of heat showing on the satellite from this firing out here. So a little bit of scattered heat kind of near Gasky, but in general, these fires are really cooled off. As we talked about at first, this is both the Biscuit Fire and the ultramafic kind of serpentine soils that have really sparse vegetation. And as we've said many times, that sparse vegetation where it's kind of dominated by kind of scrubby grass really responds quickly to changes in weather and humidity. And so there's just not a lot of fire activity out in there. No new real spread over the past 36 hours of mapping, some scattered heat interior. Even this area that burned hot during the wind event out in here is showing no heat on this mapping. Got to say that some of this mapping, there is cloud cover, and so we don't necessarily have a full scan of this, but what we like to do as kind of a backup is just turn on the satellite IR, which shows heat older than 24 hours in yellow. And we look for the orange and the red, and that's kind of where there's a little more current heat. So a little bit of new heat detection out on this far north end of the fire. That's about it for the last 24 hours. And you can see this red down here is that firing operation we're talking about, kind of out to this road system. So trying to contain this fire. This fire, some of the section in here, there's not line on it. It's not moving right now, but it doesn't mean there's not some heat that they're worried about could kind of come back up out of there. So they've been firing out here to kind of buffer Gasky from fire that might come back to life down in here. So without, as the fires are laying down right now, there's a ton of heat out there. There's a ton of kind of long-term smoldering heat. And the worry is definitely like 2 weeks from now, if we've got 2 weeks of warm and dry weather, that we could have rekindles, and especially in south-facing kind of areas that we could have new spread. So any firing they're going to be doing is they're still, don't consider this to really be contained, just because there's a lot of land to patrol and to mop up, and on a lot of the steep ground there's no lines, and these burning logs can roll downhill, etc. So I'm going to head up here to, we're northwest of Roseburg here near Umpqua. The heat satellites aren't really showing fresh heat on this fire. We do have IR here that isn't really showing, as we said, the white line is where the fire was mapped 36 hours ago. Red line is the latest mapping we've got from both the infrared and other kind of mixed methods. There's a website called NIFC Open Data, and that's where we download fire perimeters. So scattered heat inside, not really a whole lot of spread. As we looked at the ops map yesterday, we saw that there was hand line and dozer line and everything kind of tying this whole north end in, and there was still a little bit of open heat here in these bluffs above the Umpqua River. So, when you look at some of this ground, you can see why there's probably not a lot of firefighting going on when, we need to send people down there on ropes. So that's kind of one of the last open spots on this, the Rattlesnake Ridge, Tyee Ridge complex. No new spread here on this other one. Sorry, I gotta see if I can. It's Lighthouse Road fires here. Big Tom, show no spread. Chilkoot Fire. Sorry for the swerve driving. No new real spread, but scattered heat on the interior. One thing interesting on the IR, and I don't have much intel, is just that bedrock. They're showing a lot of scattered heat on the bedrock. Bedrock is pretty much it's been considered to be kind of done. And I think the fact that it's timber and heavy fuels is just a lot of scattered heat still in there. But also it's hard for me to know without kind of other sources. Like the infrared here is not showing any heat at all. So I don't know if I'm just looking at old mapping or what. McKinsey, coming up to McKinsey Bridge, the Lookout Fire, no new spread really outside. There's still heat on the north end. Horse Creek Fire showing no new heat out the previous perimeter. And we don't have any new mapping for the Camp Creek Fire. They've had weather, they've had moisture, they've gone direct on some of these areas, and the fire hasn't spread since in the latest mapping we have. So as we've said, many times, rain is really what puts out big fires. We can steer them. We can do firing operations, but a lot of these fires, we're just kind of at the mercy of the weather. Dylan Stevens, shout out. Hey, man. Glad you're watching. I've met so many awesome people through doing prescribed firework and training in the Klamath, and so it's cool to see you guys on here. I missed you guys. I've been focused on training here around Chico, so I'm not able to come up to the Klamath treks anymore. But the friendships I've made over there have really sustained me and helped me, just made me a better person. So I'd say appreciate all you folks over there. So we're going to talk about the Klamath here a little. Got about 15 minutes to talk about the Klamath. We could talk about the Klamath for hours. If you're just I like to do a little review because some folks just seeing this for the first time. Other folks have been on here a long time. But Klamath Mountains. This is where we got our current fire action for the most part. And we have a lot of fires here because it's remote. There's a lot of wilderness. Turn something on here. We've got the Marble Mountain Wilderness. We've got the Siskiyou Wilderness. We've got the Trinity Alps Wilderness. We've got the Salmon River Russian Wilderness. Castle Crags, Mount Shasta. So this part of the country is kind of like our own little private Idaho. It's wild. It's not many people out there. It's the ancestral homeland of the Kaduk and Yurok people. Kaduk people came up the river. Kaduk means upriver, Yurok means downriver. So Yurok folks, here's the mouth of the river, the Klamath. And so a lot of this is kind of Yurok territory, out like Hoopa out to the mouth, and kind of from, I guess, above Wichita, kind of Bluff Creek up is Kaduk country. And Kaduk tribe never signed a treaty, never gave up their land, but their land kind of got stolen by the Forest Service. And so a lot of interest in revitalizing cultural fire use here in the Klamath Mountains. Kaduk people burned like crazy. Well, not crazy because it was super sane. Like folks knew how to deal with fire and lit a lot of ridge tops. And interesting thing I think too is that the women were really the fire keepers for the most part, did a lot of the burning. And so there's kind of this intact culture around fire still. Families have carried it on. So we've been getting to do some training up here, helping run these training exchanges and doing landscape scale planning here for the Mid-Klamath Watershed Council and the Fire Safe Council. And a huge emphasis out here is that we've got so much fire. This is just some recent fires that there's opportunities to use fire. And there's a big emphasis in the community on fireproofing the river corridor as much as possible because this is where people live. It's where there's any sort of access and flat ground. So you got the community of Orleans, folks in Pearch Creek. You've got Soames Bar. You've got a few little hamlets like Butler and Forks of Salmon going up the Salmon River. And then not many folks at all on the Klamath, just scattered little in holdings, T-Bar, all the way up to Happy Camp. Bunch of people living in Happy Camp, Syed Valley, but almost all the people live along the river, and almost all the land not along the river is managed by the Forest Service. So a big emphasis on using fire right in the communities to protect them, and doing fuel standing work around the communities because a lot of the locals feel like, hey, we know that every year we have big fires, or every couple of years we have big fires, and then they burn all summer and the feds really can't do much to put them out until the rain happens. And that could be okay because the feds also don't have the capacity to, based on the geography and the economics and everything else, they don't have the capacity to thin and log and manage the forest with any other tool other than fire for the most part. So big interest in using fire. And what we talk about a lot on here is the puzzle pieces. We've got the 2021 McCash fire. We've got the frying pan fire. We've got the hay press fire of 2017. When you turn on the whole fire history layer, you see that there's this dozens and dozens, hundreds of fires that create this patchwork of, Slater Fire 2020, Oak Fire 2017, that these fires are basically contained from the time they start by recent fires that are not going to be able to burn into, like the McCash. So what's it take? What's it going to take for us to let fires burn? Some of these fires that are burning right now in the wilderness are just being let burn early on because of resource availability to put them out. Now, what we're seeing on the Hancock Fire is Hancock Fire here burning in Woolly Creek. James Mosher has Kaduk, a note on where their territory kind of boundary is. Okay, so Soames Bar, Salmon River, Woolly Creek, Marble Mountain Wilderness. This is all in the wilderness. So Hancock Fire started kind of late in this siege with a lightning strike that grew out. And when you look at this fire history here, we've got the McCash Fire. And the McCash Fire burned all three sides of Hancock Fire. And then this kind of turquoise color here is where it burned an overlap into, sorry, I got too many layers here. Overlapped into a fire that was 15 years old. So we see that the McCash was able to spread in a 15-year-old burn. So we got this 15-year-old burn here. And so right now they're flying. They've got crews. I don't know if they're in there yet, but the IAP was showing that they had 20-person crew, some smoke jumpers, and 2 division soups. And they're going to come out here and try to kind of box in Hancock. And so I think as far as I can tell, the worry is that McCash wraps out to here. And then you've got this kind of open corridor through here with the Hancock Fire. Where, so all this area that in here hasn't burned for 15 years. So there's big worries in this country about big east wind events. And I think the worry is that Hancock could, a couple weeks from now, flare up, sneak out here around. It's kind of held up here by the 2-year-old burn. Sneak out of here and scoot down towards Soames Bar, where quite a few folks live. It's hard to know how likely that is. And so for me, the question is, I was kind of wondering about what's going on here, and looking at the IEP, and I noticed that 2 of my friends are the 2 divisions, 2 guys that we work with a lot here in the city of Chico burning. So they're flying in and out of here, potentially right now, 20-person crew and some overhead. And so I'm just always wondering, is it worth it? As I said in my broadcast yesterday, we had the Iron 44 incident 15 years ago that we just kind of memorialized a month ago, where we flew 10 people, a whole helicopter load of firefighters crashed and burned about 40 miles from here in 2008 on a similar mission, on kind of going to put out part of a wilderness fire that really wasn't threatening much of anything. So when I look at the IAP and I see that I got a couple buddies that are kind of out here, spiked out, putting together operations to try to hold this fire on this ridge, check it up. I just kind of feel like, well, is it worth it? What's going to happen? What's the worst thing that could happen here? And how likely is that? When we've got all this country that is fire adapted, burned on a 5 to 15, 20-year interval, so it's due. Is it likely? Here's the 2008 Jake Fire, 2006 Hancock Fire. How likely is it that we're going to get an east wind event that's going to blast this fire down out of here? Especially when you look at the fuels in here, which is just a lot of brush. So I'm just curious, is this the Klamath National Forest throughout this bust has been consistently kind of messaging full suppression, we're going to put everything fire out. So my question is is this decision to put a check line in this ridge here to keep this fire from leaving, is that based on science? Is that based on model runs? Is that based on observed current fuel moistures? Is this brush even going to carry fire? When we look at this fire that burned kind of unabated for 10 days and grew to be, I don't even know how many acres, a couple hundred acres. Like, how likely is it that it's going to actually haul ass 10 miles to Somesbar later in the year? And that's so, I really want to talk to some folks at the Klamath and find out, like, what's the science behind this? What's the kind of analysis? What's the math? How do you justify flying 20-person crew in and out of this country? How do you balance that level of risk? Is the political consideration of some folks wanting to know that the forest is putting out every single fire? How do you balance that against the safety of flying 20 or 30 people out into the middle of nowhere to put out a fire that, in all likelihood, like when you look at the fire history here, like this has burned twice in the past 15 years. There's still all these trees on it, right? Like that tells you that you had lower severity fire last time, and the trees that survive previous fires tend to survive the next fire. So land needs fire. You're in the middle of the wilderness. From where I sit, pretty low odds of this blowing out of there. If this area between here and Somesbar hadn't burned for 100 years, I could see being worried that we had potential. But the fact that this area has had so much fire, and then it's not just these two fires we're looking at. When you look at the fire history, this area has got some of the kind of densest overlap of fire. There's places out here that burned 4 or 5 times in the last 50 years. So it's not one of those places that is kind of starved of fire and choked with fuels and the most explosive place on the landscape. Anyway, looking forward to kind of a little bit more research on here. I'd say that, finding out that my buddies are running the show out there, it makes it a little more personal. It makes it delicate. I don't want to be armchair quarterbacking the tactical decisions made by my friends that are not in a position to decide whether or not this fire gets put out. They just go to the fire and get in a division assignment. Anyway, managed fire in the Klamath. We'll keep talking about it. I got to bounce out of here, but I'll look at some comments real quick. James Mosher says Kaduk people were all the way up in the Scott River too. And it is clear as a bell from 7,000 feet at Bolivar Lookout. Wildfire 371. All is worth asking. Is it worth it? That's one of the first things you see, and you go into like a hell base often on a fire. Someone will tape up on the wall, is this flight necessary? Right? That's where risk management begins. All right. Hey, folks, thanks for everything. Thanks for your support. I've got to go out and do some field work next couple days, so I'm going to be out of pocket. No live stream next couple days, but we'll go get some. If there's stuff that is breaking and interesting, we'll be on Twitter talking about it. Wildland_ZKO. Hey, thanks.